Yu-Gi-Oh! Card effects are not written in stone, and while it's uncommon, cards have been changed over the years. They've corrected printing mistakes, condensed text for clarity, and they've even outright changed the effects of some older cards to make them more balanced. Today I'm going to cover the main reasons that card effects change, and also some of the unintended consequences that have happened as a result. Sometimes when a card is printed, there's an error in its text. Effect typos are pretty rare, but they have happened a few times throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. My favorite example of this is Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus, the boss monster of 2005's Fury from the Deep structure deck. I used the first edition version of this card on the playground a lot when I was a kid, but years later I learned it was missing a key part of its effect. It cannot be normal summoned or set, and to special summon it, you have to tribute a Levia Dragon Daedalus. They even had a system set up where you could mail in your incorrect copy to get a replacement with the real text, but I'm not sure how many people chose to do that. Yadokaru is a very old monster that has an effect that activates when its battle position is changed. On the original print, it said it activated when it was switched from defense to attack position, but it's actually supposed to be the other way around. This was then fixed with the unlimited run of Metal Raiders, but the first edition copies don't have the correct text. I do want to mention that even if you use an older copy of a card, the newest effect is always applied. Even if your copy of Ocean Dragon Lord doesn't mention its summoning requirement, that doesn't mean you can ignore it. At tournaments, you are even required to tell your opponent if your card has outdated text. Another reason a card effect might change is to simply condense it by removing unnecessary sentences. For example, the early prints of both Maneater Bug and Reinforcement of the Army had some funny text that didn't really need to be there. Maneater Bug clarified that you can destroy a monster regardless of its position, and Reinforcement clarified that you have to shuffle your deck after adding a card. Maneater Bug doesn't need to say regardless of position because that's implied unless it says otherwise. Searcher cards don't need to tell you to shuffle the deck after each search because the rules already require you to do that. Yu-Gi-Oh! Already has a bad reputation for long card effects, so there's no reason to keep unneeded text. In 2011, the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG started writing effects using new problem-solving card text. This is what players are referring to when they talk about the exact wording and punctuation of effects when figuring out rulings. There are lots of benefits to this writing style, but the biggest one is consistency across cards. To better understand why this was such an important change, let's take a look at 3 old-school battle traps: Magic Cylinder, Sakuretsu Armor, and Negate Attack. 2 of these 3 cards target the attacking monster, but you won't find the word target on any of their early prints. I'll give you a moment to figure out which one doesn't target. Any guesses? Well, I hate to admit this, but I lied. All 3 of them target. This was annoying because back in the day, there wasn't an easy explanation for why those cards were different from Mirror Force and Widespread Ruin, which didn't target. Now though, if a card targets, it says the word target, and if it doesn't target, then it doesn't say target. It's actually just that simple. This was a card text problem that was solved by problem-solving card text. Old school cards also weren't great about showing you the difference between their cost and effect. Let's say your opponent normal summons a monster and you respond with Solemn Judgment, paying half your life points to negate that summon. If your opponent then flips their Solemn Judgment to stop yours, you still pay half your life points because that was the cost, not the effect. This is a very important distinction to make because a cost is paid to activate a card in the first place while the effect happens on resolution. When the Dark World cards were first released, players were often confused about which cards triggered their effects. Dark World monsters activate when you discard them for a card effect, but not when you discard them for a cost. At my school, this caused constant arguments because we couldn't understand why Lightning Vortex didn't trigger their effects while Dark World Lightning did. Newer cards, though, use clear punctuation to show the difference between cost and effect, which streamlines the entire process. Problem-solving card text also introduced some keywords into the game. Old cards used to say, when this card attacks with an attack that is higher than the defense of your opponent's defense position monster, inflict the difference as battle damage to your opponent's life points. These days, we just call that piercing battle damage. People often refer to Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game for lawyers, in part because of problem-solving card text being so specific, but cards become a lot easier to read once you understand how it works. So far, we've covered text corrections and cleanups, but those aren't the only times cards have been updated. In 2014, they started fundamentally changing some card effects to help balance them out after release. Some cards had slight restrictions added, while others received a complete overhaul. This was primarily done to allow iconic banned cards to come back into the game with nerfed abilities, but the community has had some mixed feelings about the new effects. Two of the earliest examples of these types of balance changes are Catapult Turtle and Dark Strike Fighter. Both of these cards allowed players to inflict massive burn damage against their opponents to quickly close out games, oftentimes on the very first turn. To remedy the situation, they put a soft once per turn on Catapult Turtle and a hard once per turn on Dark Strike Fighter. Dark Strike Fighter was also given a main phase 1 requirement so that it could no longer attack directly and then tribute itself in main phase 2. I think changes like this are completely fine. These cards were mainly broken because you could use them multiple times in the same turn, so this was a simple fix. Other cards were slowed down. Future Fusion, for example, no longer sends the material to the graveyard immediately, but rather during your first standby phase after activating it. With Sinister Serpent, if you add it back to your hand during your standby phase, it now banishes itself from your graveyard during your opponent's next end phase. This means that if you don't slow down and wait to use it, you won't be getting it back over and over again. Two of my favorite old school cards, Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, now prevent you from activating the effects of the monster that you add to your hand until the end of the turn. This initially seemed like an unnecessary change, but once we got Link 1 monsters, it made a lot more sense. Cards like Salamangreat Almirage allow you to normal summon Sangan, link it away, and then instantly search a monster, all without any setup. Crush Card Virus was one of the most powerful prize cards of all time, and to unban it, they changed its effect so much that it's basically a new card. You no longer get to look at your opponent's draws the next 3 turns, it prevents you from doing damage, and your opponent gets to destroy 3 monsters from their deck, which potentially triggers a bunch of graveyard effects. Chaos Emperor Dragon is another card that was given a heavy restriction. You're no longer allowed to use any other cards or effects in the same turn that you use its effect. Sure, the original effect wasn't balanced at all, and that's why it got banned, but why not leave it banned and create a new card instead? The funny thing is that even after the errata, they still made a retrain. What I want to highlight now are a couple of unfortunate situations that have popped up because of all of these card effect changes. Let's start by talking about Change of Heart and Brain Control. Change of Heart was released really early on in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and it was incredibly powerful. It was so good that they banned it. A few years later, they released Brain Control, which was essentially Change of Heart with a couple new restrictions. You have to pay 800 life points to activate it, and it can only steal face-up monsters. Despite these restrictions, Brain Control was still an incredibly popular card and tons of people played it. It was considered a staple for a long time, but with the release of Synchro Monsters, suddenly it became a lot better. Even though Brain Control was just a worse version of Change of Heart, it was still strong, especially because you could steal an opponent's monster and then immediately use it for a Synchro summon, so they banned it. Years go by and eventually they unbanned Brain Control with a new errata. It now could only target monsters that could be normal summoned or set. This means that it couldn't steal cards like BLS or Dark Armed Dragon anymore because those cards can only be special summoned, but also you couldn't take extra deck monsters either. This greatly restricted it, and even though it was unbanned, nobody played it. Even more time passes and they unbanned Change of Heart with no errata. This meant that we now had Change of Heart alongside a nerfed version version of a nerfed version of it at the same time. This is especially funny in Master Duel because Change of Heart and Snatch Steel are both unlimited with their original effects, but brain control still sucks. Another example is the tragedy of Goyo Guardian. Goyo Guardian was one of the first synchro monsters released, and it was the best level 6 synchro for a long time. Unsurprisingly, it was so broken that they banned it in the TCG and OCG formats. Several years later, at the end of 2014, the TCG decided to unban Goyo Guardian, and by that point it was power crept. People didn't really play it. The OCG must have been a lot more scared of Goyo Guardian though, because when they brought it back, they changed it so you now had to use an Earth tuner. The problem was that the TCG had to follow suit, so they nerfed a card that already wasn't seeing play. Even though the TCG and OCG are separate formats, they do try to keep card text consistent across both of them. As you can probably guess, because the original version didn't see play when it was unbanned in 2014, this newer version basically killed any chance of it ever seeing play again. These days, Konami brings back a banned card with a new effect every once in a while, like once in a year, but usually it's just to put a hard once per turn restriction on their ability. That type of change is fine, but I still don't like complete overhauls. I understand the appeal of bringing back old banned cards, but if they're going to fundamentally change their effects, then I'd prefer if they just made a retrain. It's cool that we're able to play Crush Card Virus again, but is it really Crush Card Virus? I'm not so sure. Anyway, thanks for watching today's discussion video, and I'll catch you guys later.